The lights were merciless, bright enough to reveal every blink, every twitch of discomfort. The air in the studio hummed with the kind of quiet that only comes before a televised storm. On one side of the split screen sat Alan Dershowitz, his posture straight, his tone dripping with the self-assured cadence of someone too used to being the smartest man in the room. He launched into his monologue like a conductor waving an invisible baton. Words like precedent, jurisprudence, and constitutional immunity rolled off his tongue as though they alone carried moral authority. The audience listened, half in awe, half in exhaustion. Somewhere in the front row, a young woman shook her head slowly. Jasmine Crockett sat across from him, still, observant, almost motionless, the kind of stillness that announces intention. Her eyes didn't flinch. She waited for his sentences to end, but they never did. He moved from one justification to the next, weaving a safety net of language around power itself. "Professor," she finally said, her voice steady, quiet enough to draw the cameras closer. "You've given a lot of reasons for why powerful men should be protected." He didn't stop talking. She leaned forward. "But I just want to ask you one thing." The moderator froze. The room, for the first time, tilted toward her. "With all due respect, who are you protecting?" Silence. Even the studio lights seemed to hesitate. Alan blinked, his hands suspended mid-gesture. For a moment, it was as if the conversation had cracked open, revealing the uncomfortable question beneath all his polished reasoning. He tried to smile it off, a half-laugh, half-scoff that didn't quite land. "Congresswoman, that's a complicated, it shouldn't be," she said softly. "Justice isn't supposed to depend on who can afford your defense." The host's jaw slackened. Someone coughed. The camera zoomed in again, capturing the moment the audience felt, not heard, but felt, that something irreversible had just shifted. In living rooms and news feeds across the country, viewers sat forward, stunned by the simplicity of it. One question. One silence. One truth that couldn't be argued away, and no one in that studio could have predicted how quickly the tables would turn. Before the silence that made headlines, there was the setup, a polished stage, a polished topic, and two people who could not have come from more different worlds. The network had titled the segment "Constitutional Accountability in a Divided America." The kind of headline that promised civility but quietly anticipated chaos. Alan Dershowitz arrived early, crisp suit, blue tie, the gleam of a man still addicted to relevance. The producers loved him. He was, after all, the face that could turn legal complexity into primetime television. A living brand of authority. When he spoke, networks leaned in, because controversy was ratings. Jasmine Crockett arrived later, quietly, no entourage. She adjusted her mic herself, thanked the crew, smiled at the makeup artist, and took her seat with a calm that felt deliberate. She wasn't there for theater. She was there for truth. And that difference would define everything that followed. The debate began with the usual rhythm, the professor framing his defensive process over passion, arguing that even the most powerful deserved protection from political overreach. He spoke of precedent and tradition, of not bending rules just to satisfy public anger. His tone was smooth, his metaphors well-worn, but beneath the studio lights, something felt off. Maybe it was the way he referred to the public, as if it were an unruly child that didn't understand the law. Or maybe it was the exhaustion in the audience's faces, the kind of fatigue that comes from watching power excuse itself one too many times. People were tired. Tired of loopholes. Tired of moral gymnastics. Tired of seeing consequences become optional for the privileged. On social media, the live tweet crowd had already split into two camps. One half typed reverent threads about Dershowitz's brilliance. The other half replied with fire emojis and the word "out of touch." The tension wasn't just in the studio, it was in every living room watching. Jasmine listened through his first long answer, nodding politely, pen poised but unmoving. She let him finish every sentence. She didn't need to interrupt. Arrogance always reveals itself if you let it talk long enough. Then came her turn. She began with gratitude, for his years of service, his mind, his influence. Her tone was respectful, even gentle. It was the kind of politeness that makes arrogance drop its guard. "Professor," she said, "you've seen the law evolve for decades. You've helped shape it. But for many Americans, the law seems to protect those already at the top." He smiled faintly, ready with a practiced rebuttal. "That's an unfair oversimplification, Congresswoman." "The law," she continued, unbothered. "No, I understand. You're saying we must preserve the system as it is. But what happens when the system stops preserving us? That line hit the air like a spark. Even the studio crew paused. Online, comment threads ignited, "She's coming for him." Finally someone said it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't grandstand. She simply shifted the gravity of the room. What she asked next, the narrator would later say in every replay and recap, would echo across every news feed. The moderators sensed it too, the shift from debate to reckoning. They tried to move to the next question, but it was too late. The audience wasn't blinking anymore, they were locked in, because Jasmine Crockett wasn't there to play nice, she was there to ask what millions had been asking long before that night in the studio. Alan Dershowitz had been a name synonymous with the courtroom, the man who could twist the spine of the law until it stood on his side. To some, he was a legend. To others, a symbol of how intellect can sometimes outgrow integrity. It began decades earlier. A young prodigy at Harvard Law, hailed for his mind, not yet scarred by the politics of power. He believed the law was a game of precision, that truth could be constructed through argument, not discovered through empathy. Professors whispered about his brilliance. Students followed him like he was a prophet of reason. He liked that. The attention. The applause. The idea that the world's chaos could be tamed by someone like him, armed with logic sharper than any blade. Then came the clients. The ones nobody wanted. The famous. The untouchable. The ones with money and stories that smelled of guilt. They came to him because he could do what others couldn't, make sin sound constitutional. A flash of cameras outside courthouses. Alan striding past reporters, expression steady, flanked by assistants holding binders thick with arguments. Everyone deserves a defense, he'd say, voice calm, absolute, untouchable. And technically, he was right. But somewhere along the line, the defense became the identity. Every new case brought higher stakes, and higher fees. He became the man who defended the indefensible, who found morality in loopholes. From celebrities accused of crimes to billionaires facing scandal, his name appeared in headlines like a seal of legitimacy. The powerful sought him because he was brilliant. They kept him because he never asked if they were right. There was always that moment, after the verdicts, after the settlements, when Alan would walk back to his brownstone apartment and tell himself he'd done his job. That was the rule of law. That was justice. But sometimes, in the quiet between interviews, a doubt would flicker like static. Had he won cases, or had he simply taught guilt how to hide? Still, the world rewarded him. Book deals followed. Talk shows. Panels. Invitations to defend his philosophy on air. His words became a brand, measured, precise, eloquent. He loved reminding people that emotion had no place in law, that the world's problems could be reasoned away if people just thought more and felt less. Over the years, he turned courtroom victories into moral armor. When critics called him a mercenary for the elite, he smiled and quoted legal doctrine. "You can't hate the player," he'd say on television, "if you don't understand the game." The audience would laugh. The host would nod. The myth of brilliance grew, but brilliance has its blind spots. Somewhere between the arguments and applause, he stopped listening. He began to believe that truth itself was negotiable, that justice was something only men like him could define. To question him was to question reason itself. That belief followed him into every debate, every interview. It wasn't arrogance in his mind, it was certainty. Certainty that his logic could crush any opponent's feeling. Certainty that intellect was the ultimate weapon. So when the producers invited him to that constitutional accountability panel, he didn't see it as a challenge. He saw it as another lecture, another chance to remind the world that emotion loses, logic wins. In his mind, Jasmine Crockett was just another politician eager for applause, another headline hunter who'd vanish when the cameras stopped rolling. He didn't recognize the kind of truth that doesn't need to shout. In the green room before the show, he smiled at his reflection, straightened his tie, and told an aide, "It's good they're putting me next to her. It'll be educational." He meant it as a compliment, or maybe a warning. To him, this wasn't a debate of equals. It was a performance he'd already scripted in his head. He'd speak in the language of law, she'd speak in the language of outrage. And he'd win, because reason always triumphs over noise. Or so he believed. When the cameras rolled, and the conversation began, that same confidence carried him. The tone, the cadence, the pauses, he'd mastered the rhythm of televised control. Every time Jasmine looked ready to interject, he quickened his pace, the verbal equivalent of closing a door. But every fortress built on intellect eventually meets the one thing it can't calculate, Conscience.as he spoke that night, defending yet another powerful man accused of abusing his influence. The same formula played out. Legal definitions. Dispassionate logic. Detached morality. The system, he said, was bigger than feelings, but the audience wasn't nodding this time. The room felt heavier. The logic felt thinner. The disconnect, between theory and truth, was finally visible. For the first time in years, Alan Dershowitz's words weren't landing, because the courtroom of public conscience plays by different rules. Before the studio lights and the viral moment, there was South Dallas, cracked sidewalks, sunburned porches, and a skyline that shimmered like a promise few ever reached. Jasmine Crockett grew up there, in a neighborhood that taught her everything textbooks couldn't, that survival was its own kind of intelligence, and silence was never protection. Her mother worked nights, often too tired to talk in the mornings. Her father left early and came home later, hand-stained from the factory floor. They didn't talk about politics, they talked about bills, about safety, about trying to stay one paycheck ahead of disaster. Jasmine watched her parents argue with utility companies more often than with each other. She saw how dignity could bend beneath bureaucracy. She saw how easy it was for the poor to disappear, not just from opportunity, but from empathy. When she told her high school counselor she wanted to be a lawyer, the woman smiled politely and said, "You're passionate, Jasmine. Maybe social work?" Jasmine didn't argue then. She just nodded, walked out, and decided she would argue everywhere else instead. College came with debt and doubt. Law school came with exhaustion. She worked nights in diners, mornings in libraries, and learned that ambition wasn't glamorous, it was lonely. She lost friends to burnout, to bills, to disbelief. But she stayed. When she passed the bar, she didn't head to a firm with glass walls and catered lunches. She went to the public defender's office, where the air smelled like stale coffee and the clients arrived in handcuffs. She remembered her first case, a young man accused of theft, barely 20. He swore he didn't do it, and she believed him, maybe too much. She fought for him like she was fighting for her own brother. The verdict came back guilty. That night, she sat in her parked car outside the courthouse until sunrise, replaying every argument, every missed word. It would have been easier to leave. But quitting would have been another verdict she couldn't live with. So she stayed. Case after case. Win some, lose more. She met mothers who worked 2 jobs and still lost custody. Teenagers whose first mistake became their last chance. Men who hadn't been called by their first name in years. In those courtrooms, she learned that truth doesn't always sound polished. Sometimes it stumbles. Sometimes it cries. Sometimes it doesn't have the right vocabulary, but it has the right soul. She also learned what arrogance looked like, not always cruel, but certain. Men in expensive suits who said the law the way some people said God. Judges who smiled like they were watching a play instead of deciding a life. Prosecutors who never saw faces, only files. She faced them all, loud men, confident men, men who called her young lady as if competence came with gray hair. But she didn't fight them with volume. She fought with patience. With precision. With something harder to shake, moral clarity. She'd faced louder men than him, her old mentor used to say, half admiring, half warning. And she faced them in courtrooms without cameras. Still, even for someone like Jasmine, doubt had a way of sneaking in. There were nights when she'd stare at her reflection and wonder if the fight was changing anything at all. If justice was real, or just a story people told to sleep better. But every time she visited a client who'd finally walked free, every time she saw a family reunited, every time someone said, "You listened to me when no one else did," the doubt softened. Maybe justice wasn't a system, maybe it was a series of small defiant acts. Her transition to politics wasn't a career move. It was surrender to inevitability. She'd spent years fixing symptoms, now she wanted to cure the disease. When she first ran for office, she didn't have big donors. She had volunteers who believed. Her campaign office was a rented storefront that still smelled of the barbershop that came before it. The first time she debated an opponent on live television, she wore the same steady calm she'd carried through every courtroom. He interrupted. She waited. He mocked. She smiled. When it was her turn, she spoke softly, and left the audience silent. By the time she reached Congress, she carried that same composure. People called it poise. It wasn't. It was armor forged in rooms where she had to earn every inch of respect. So when the network producers invited her to sit across from Alan Dershowitz, they didn't know what they were really inviting. They thought they were booking Contrast, the legendary scholar versus the fiery freshman. What they were getting was something different, experience versus entitlement. Before the show began, she sat in the green room scrolling through her notes, not for facts, she already knew them, but for focus. A staffer reminded her to keep it measured. She smiled. "I don't yell," she said. "I just don't flinch." When the cameras turned on and the lights flared white, she felt none of the nerves people expected. For her, it was just another courtroom, same arrogance, different venue. Alan talked. The audience nodded. The host smiled. It was all theater, but Jasmine had seen worse performances that decided people's fates. She knew how to wait for the right opening, how to let a man's own words build his cage, because she hadn't come to match his eloquence. She'd come to expose the comfort behind it. To remind the world that the law without compassion is just paperwork, and now, under the brightest lights, that experience would become her weapon. The tension in the studio rose like heat before a storm. Cameras rolled, audience hushed, the red light glowed steady, live. Alan Dershowitz adjusted his glasses, his tone rehearsed, precise. "Congresswoman," he began, smiling that television smile, "I appreciate your passion, but constitutional accountability doesn't mean mob justice. We must separate law from outrage." He paused for effect, scanning the audience like a professor waiting for a nod of agreement. A few did nod, older faces, polite applause. But most just stared, uncertain whether they were watching reason or arrogance. Jasmine Crockett didn't move. She waited, pen still, lips pressed in thought. Then she leaned in slightly, just enough to shift the frame. "Mob justice," she repeated. "You mean the public wanting accountability?" Alan smiled again, a touch sharper now. "I mean the danger of substituting feelings for facts. You see, Congresswoman, the Constitution, she interrupted, was written by people who also had feelings, strong ones. About tyranny. About corruption. About right and wrong." That landed like a quiet jab. The audience murmured. A camera zoomed closer. The host straightened in his chair, sensing a spark. Alan raised his hand, the gesture of a man reclaiming control. "With all due respect, emotional rhetoric doesn't build justice systems. Procedures do. We have checks and balances for a reason. You can't just, Professor," Jasmine said, her tone still calm but her gaze unflinching, "you keep saying procedure as if it's holy scripture. But who writes those procedures? Who benefits from them staying exactly the same?" A soft gasp rippled through the audience. The host let out a nervous laugh, half hoping to defuse the charge. "Well, we're certainly diving deep tonight," he said, but neither of them looked at him. Alan blinked, regrouped. "The system exists to protect everyone equally. Even the unpopular. And yet somehow," she replied, "it keeps protecting the same few." That line drew applause, hesitant at first, then louder, until it filled the studio. Alan tried to speak over it, voice clipped now, words tripping on their own certainty. "You're misunderstanding the principle of equal protection. I understand it," she cut in, firm but never raised. "I've lived the side where it doesn't show up." Silence again. The kind that feels like someone turned off the air. The host cleared his throat. Let's remember, this is about the rule of law, not personal experience." Jasmine turned her head just slightly toward him. "Personal experience is the rule of law for most Americans," she said. "They don't quote case studies. They quote what happens to them." A woman in the audience clapped once, loud. Then another. Then a wave of applause rolled through. Alan's smile tightened. He reached for another lifeline. "Congresswoman, if we start governing by sentiment, we end up destroying the very safeguards that keep democracy intact." She nodded. "I agree, Professor. Safeguards matter. But what happens when they start protecting power instead of people?" Another murmur. Another tightening of the air. The rhythm had shifted completely. Every time he deflected, she folded it back into truth. Every time he reached for theory, she answered with reality. He leaned forward, voice edging toward frustration. "You're simplifying complex legal issues into emotional slogans. And you're complicating human suffering into legal excuses." That one hit. The crowd erupted, clapping, gasping, a few people standing. The host tried again to regain control, but it was useless. Alan looked at her, incredulous, as if reason itself had been insulted. I'm explaining how justice works. Jasmine tilted her head, her voice barely above a whisper. No, Professor. You're explaining how it's been allowed to work. The applause came faster this time, stronger. She didn't move, didn't gloat, didn't smirk. Her calm was unnerving. It wasn't performance, it was conviction. Alan adjusted his tie, exhaled sharply, then leaned back as if conceding the tempo but not the battle. You're making this personal, he said. She looked straight into the camera, her voice even. It is personal. For everyone who's ever been told to wait their turn for fairness. The room fell utterly still. The moderator blinked, speechless. Somewhere, a producer whispered, "Keep rolling." And Jasmine sat back, her eyes steady, knowing what the audience was starting to sense, that something irreversible was about to happen until she asked the question, the one that broke the professor's armor. The debate reached that eerie stillness, the one that happens when everyone in the room senses they're about to witness a shift. The lights hummed softly above the stage, the cameras zoomed tighter, the air itself seemed to lean in. Alan Dershowitz was still talking, but the energy had changed. His words came faster now, like stones skipping on shallow water. Congresswoman, you're ignoring the complexity of our judicial system, he said, voice rising, eyes bright with the thrill of rebuttal. We have mechanisms, we have checks, we have protections. Without them, chaos reigns. Jasmine nodded slowly, letting him finish, not out of politeness, but precision. Every debater knows the value of silence, hers was surgical. She let his logic run full circle, let it trap itself. Then, when he paused to inhale, she leaned forward slightly, elbows on the desk, voice low enough that the microphones had to stretch to catch it. Professor, she began, her tone measured, intimate. I hear you talk about protections. Mechanisms. Checks and balances. But I've seen how those mechanisms feel when you're on the wrong side of the privilege line. Alan raised his eyebrows, almost amused. With all due respect, you're politicizing. She didn't blink. I'm humanizing. That stopped him. A ripple of surprise moved through the studio, her voice softened, not angry, not loud, but impossibly steady. Let me ask you something, she said. If justice only works for those who can afford you, what kind of justice is that? Silence, absolute, aching silence. The sentence hit like a dropped match in a room full of gas. No theatrics, no shout. Just truth laid bare. Alan froze, lips parted, his response caught somewhere between denial and disbelief. He blinked once. Twice. The weight of the question hung between them like smoke. The camera found his face, the practiced calm unraveling, the tiny tremor in his jawline. Another camera switched to Jasmine, still, composed, eyes unyielding. She didn't flinch. Didn't smile. She just waited, hands folded loosely on the table, as if giving the law itself a chance to answer. The host opened his mouth, then closed it again. The control room whispered over the headset, "Stay on her. Don't cut. Stay." The audience held their breath. You could hear the hum of the studio lights, the faint rustle of someone shifting in their seat. Alan tried to recover. Congresswoman, that's a clever line. She tilted her head slightly, cutting him off without raising her voice. It's not a line, Professor. It's a life. That landed even harder. Someone in the audience whispered wow. Another clapped once, uncertain if they were allowed to. Alan searched for footing, for words that might pull him back to higher ground. Justice, he began, voice thinner now, isn't about affordability, it's about access. Access, she echoed, that disappears the moment the bill arrives. A small gasp, then another. The crowd was shifting, sensing blood in the water, not because she was attacking, but because she wasn't. She was simply exposing what everyone already knew but never heard said out loud. Alan blinked rapidly, fingers drumming on the table. You're turning this into class warfare, he said, half defiant, half defensive. She shook her head slowly. No, Professor. The war started long before I got here. Some of us just stopped pretending not to see it. The audience burst into applause this time, unrestrained, spontaneous. The sound filled the room like thunder rolling through glass. The host tried to speak over it, his voice cracking with nervous laughter. All right, let's stay civil, folks. But the civility had already changed sides. Alan leaned back, the sheen of authority slipping. He forced a smile, the kind meant to signal control, but it faltered under the weight of her stillness. "You're being emotional again," he muttered, but even he didn't sound convinced. Jasmine's reply came with quiet finality. "Emotion built this country, Professor. People felt before they wrote laws. They believed before they drafted documents. Justice was born out of feeling, not fear." It wasn't a retort. It was a requiem. The crowd rose in pockets, half standing, half applauding, the other half just staring. The host gestured for calm, but it was too late. The energy had shifted permanently. The battle wasn't intellectual anymore, it was moral, and the silence that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Full of reflection, of realization, of the collective heartbeat of people who suddenly saw themselves represented in one unflinching sentence. In homes across America, viewers watching live felt that same pulse. Some mouthed the words along with her, rewinding, replaying. Others texted them to friends. Within minutes, the line was clipped, subtitled, looped, uploaded. "If justice only works for those who can afford you, what kind of justice is that?" It flashed across phones, timelines, and group chats. It became a caption. A rallying cry. A mirror. A teenager in Chicago posted the clip with the caption, "She said what my mom's been saying my whole life." A law student in DC tweeted, "This is why I'm studying. This. Right here." A veteran shared it on Facebook with 3 words, "Truth. Finally spoken." In a matter of hours, the clip transcended politics. It became something else, a moment of moral equilibrium. A reminder that intelligence without empathy is just noise. Back in the studio, the cameras kept rolling. Alan adjusted his tie again, the silence stretching too long. He forced another smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Jasmine finally leaned back in her chair, her gaze softening, not in victory, but release. She'd said what needed to be said. Nothing more. Nothing less. The host exhaled, relief and awe tangled in his tone. "Congresswoman Crockett," he said finally, that's quite a question." She nodded once. "It's the one we all should be asking." And with that, the tension broke, applause, cheers, flashes, the hum of the studio reclaiming its sound. But something fundamental had changed, because in one sentence, she hadn't just silenced a man. She'd quieted a century of excuses, and within minutes, that single line had left the internet on fire. By the time the credits rolled and the cameras cooled, the internet was already burning. The clip had escaped the studio before the crew could even wrap cables. Someone in the control room had uploaded the moment, that 12-second stretch of truth, to a live feed, and it took only minutes for the algorithms to taste blood. Hashtags sprouted like wildfire, hashtag Crockett question, hashtag truth over titles, hashtag justice for all. Within the first hour, it had been viewed 500,000 times. By sunrise, 20 million. The video opened mid-sentence, Jasmine leaning in, the lights hot on her face, saying softly, "If justice only works for those who can afford you, what kind of justice is that?" The pause. The silence. The camera cutting to Alan's stunned expression. It was cinematic perfection, no music, no edit, just the raw electricity of truth landing exactly where it was meant to. Influencers clipped it, added captions, slowed the playback for emphasis. One popular TikTok creator stitched her own face next to Jasmine's, whispering, "Say it again for the people in the back." The comment section erupted, crying emojis, fire emojis, hearts, and 1,000 variations of "she ate." Journalists scrambled to react. The morning after, cable news split in half. Some called it a populist outburst, others a masterclass in controlled rhetoric. One conservative columnist complained that Crockett had weaponized empathy, while a progressive op-ed declared, "Finally, a politician who speaks fluent humanity." Clips from reaction videos flooded YouTube. College students dissected her delivery like it was literature. Debate coaches replayed her phrasing for students, "See that pause? That's how you let the silence work for you." Law professors grudgingly admitted it was emotionally strategic. And the general public didn't care about strategy, they cared that someone had finally said what they'd been feeling for years. On Twitter, or whatever name the platform was wearing that week, her quote became a signature line in bios. "If justice only works for those who can afford you," followed by scales of justice emojis. Artists painted it on murals. Protest signs appeared within 48 hours. Even the memes carried reverence, her calm face photoshopped beside historical icons, with captions like, "Same energy." Meanwhile, in the high towers of punditry, unease brewed. Panels on elite media networks debated tone instead of truth. One veteran commentator sighed, "It was dramatic, sure, but let's not confuse viral with virtuous." Another countered, "Maybe drama is what virtue sounds like when people stop listening." The split was clear. Those who lived the struggle saw courage. Those who lived above it saw theatered. In barbershops across Atlanta, men paused mid-trim to replay the moment on their phones, nodding in that slow, wordless way that means respect. "That sister wasn't scared of him," one said, shaking his head. "She talked to him like he was just another man." In a Houston classroom, a civics teacher paused the clip halfway through and asked her students, "What's she really asking?" A hand shot up. "She's asking why the system only loves rich people," said a girl in the back. The class murmured in agreement. In a cafe in Detroit, a group of older women watched the clip on loop. One of them, gray braids, eyes soft but fierce, wiped a tear with a napkin. "She reminded me of Fannie Lou Hamer," she whispered. "Tired of being sick and tired." Even late-night hosts joined the chorus. One cracked a joke. Alan Dershowitz went from Harvard Law to getting schooled on live TV, but then added sincerely, "That's not just a mic drop, that's a mirror drop." Meanwhile, Alan's publicist went silent. His scheduled morning interviews were postponed. The man who'd spent decades mastering the art of rebuttal now faced something that couldn't be argued away: collective recognition. The clip didn't just trend, it transformed. It wasn't just watched, it was felt. In grocery store lines, in group chats, in whispered conversations between people who had long stopped believing the system could hear them, and through it all, Jasmine Crockett stayed quiet. No press conferences. No follow-up interviews. Just one tweet the next morning: "Justice isn't for sale." Never was supposed to be. It got 5 million likes. The silence from her afterward made the moment even louder. People projected their own stories onto her words: a single mother fighting eviction, a laid-off worker suing for unpaid wages, a young activist staring down authority. For once, the truth didn't belong to a headline, it belonged to everyone. As the weekend rolled on, talk shows, op-eds, and podcasts dissected the question, each trying to own it. But they missed the point. The power wasn't in the phrasing, it was in the quiet after. That unflinching stillness where arrogance met accountability, and in that silence, millions of people found a new kind of sound, recognition. The world didn't need another debate. It needed a reminder that justice, stripped of empathy, isn't justice at all. The camera might have stopped rolling, but the conversation didn't. The clip replayed in airports, classrooms, break rooms, and living rooms, a single question turning strangers into witnesses, and behind every replay was that same stunned feeling. For once, someone had said it, clearly, calmly, without apology, but behind the viral moment lay something deeper, a shift in how power is questioned. When the headlines finally cooled and the world moved on to its next uproar, Jasmine Crockett sat alone in her office, the city lights of Washington glittering outside like a restless constellation. Her phone was still buzzing: congratulations, requests, offers, noise. But she didn't reach for it. She stared at her reflection in the dark window and whispered to herself, "I didn't want to win a debate, I wanted honesty." For her, that night hadn't been about the spectacle. It wasn't about silencing anyone. It was about asking out loud what too many people had been forced to ask in silence. She hadn't expected the reaction, the millions of views, the endless replays, the murals, the hashtags. What she wanted was smaller, simpler, a moment of truth that couldn't be spun. The truth had come out of her naturally, like a breath she'd been holding for years. And when it landed, it didn't echo with triumph, it settled with peace. Jasmine had seen enough of the world to know that arrogance is loud, but dignity doesn't need a microphone. She'd learned that in courtrooms where justice was rationed, in neighborhoods where laws arrived late, if at all. She knew that when someone refuses to raise their voice, it's not weakness, it's mastery. The night of the debate, she hadn't raised her voice once. And still, the room went quiet. Her words had done what shouting couldn't. They made people listen. Across the country, those 12 seconds of calm had become a mirror. People didn't just see a congresswoman standing up to an old institution, they saw themselves, the underpaid teacher, the ignored nurse, the overlooked parent. The ones told they were too emotional, too reactive, too passionate. The ones silenced by experts who confused eloquence with truth. In that single exchange, Jasmine had reminded them that intellect without integrity is empty, that expertise without empathy becomes manipulation. The power of that night wasn't in her question alone, but in the grace with which she asked it. She hadn't attacked him. She hadn't mocked him. She had simply asked him to look at himself, and, through him, asked the nation to do the same. It wasn't about Alan Dershowitz anymore. It never really was. He was just the stand-in for something older, bigger, the comfort of privilege, the illusion that logic belongs only to the elite. Jasmine's question cracked that illusion open. In the days that followed, she noticed the shift in tone. Reporters no longer asked her if she felt emotional. They asked what justice should feel like. People stopped debating whether she was right or wrong and started asking whether the system had ever been right at all. That was the quiet revolution she'd hoped for, not rage, not vengeance, but recognition. She thought back to the studio, the blinding lights, the restless cameras, the silence that had felt almost sacred. In that stillness, she realized, truth doesn't shout because it doesn't have to. It stands. It waits. It lets arrogance talk itself into a corner and then simply asks, why? And when truth is spoken plainly, even the loudest titles grow quiet. She smiled faintly at that thought, tapping her pen on the desk. Outside, the traffic below moved in slow waves of red and white, the city breathing, unaware of the small victories that keep it alive. Somewhere out there, someone was replaying the clip again, hearing those same words and feeling that same spark of courage. Jasmine didn't need to speak again. She'd said enough. Sometimes leadership isn't about saying more, it's about saying something that stays. Her staff would later describe that night as her breakout moment, but she never liked the phrase. Breakout implied escape. She wasn't escaping anything, she was arriving. She stood, turned off the lights, and let the darkness wrap the room in quiet. In that quiet, she felt what the world had felt when she asked that question, not victory, not noise, but clarity, and that silence was the sound of accountability. The studio lights dimmed one by one, their glow fading into the hum of cooling cameras. The stage where it happened, where arrogance met quiet truth, now sat empty, but the echo of her words lingered like a heartbeat that refused to fade. Somewhere, the replay rolled again. The same question. The same stillness. The same moment when intellect bowed to integrity. It wasn't just a viral clip anymore, it was a timestamp in the public conscience, proof that sometimes a whisper can move a mountain. The narrator's voice carried softly over the last shot, Jasmine standing under those lights, head slightly tilted, eyes steady, calm. In an age of noise, the voice said, one question rewrote the power dynamic. Not through outrage, not through volume, but through truth that refused to apologize. The screen cut between faces, students debating, workers nodding in break rooms, elders smiling faintly at their phones. The country wasn't united by agreement, it was united by recognition. For once, everyone understood what they'd seen, a moment when courage looked like calm, and justice spoke in plain English. The narrator's tone rose gently, carrying the final invitation. If you believe the mic belongs to those who speak for the voiceless, share this. Let the truth travel farther than the noise ever could. The music swelled, low strings, steady, dignified. A final montage played, city lights at dusk, hands clapping in slow motion, a close-up of Jasmine's composed face before the fade. Then, in white text over black, because justice isn't about who speaks the loudest, it's about who finally speaks the truth, and the screen faded to silence. The same kind of silence that started it all, the sound of accountability.